You're no longer family. The words folded into the cold like smoke and stayed there. They hung between me and the church door, while my breath made small ghosts in the air, and my rosary felt heavier than it had any right to be. My name is Ruth Anne. I live in a little Vermont town that people drive through to get to the mountains. Maple trees line the main road, and in winter, the church spire looks like it was carved out of the soft blue of the sky. If you're watching, tell me where you're watching from. I always like to know who's listening from across the miles. I've held a lot of things in my hands in my life. I've held a newborn and a pill bottle and the calluses of work. I held Matthew's hand the first night he slept in his own bed, and I held the guitar he learned to play in the kitchen near our window when he was a boy. That guitar used to sit where the light came in best. It had a nick on the varnish from when he swung it and misjudged a chord. He kept all his books in boxes by the stove for a long time because we didn't have a proper shelf. We made a home out of what we had, and that was enough. I'm a widow. Matthew's father died years ago. No need to name how. What mattered was that it was just the two of us after that. Raising him was the whole of my life in those years. School lunches, sewing buttons back on, listening to late-night worries about exams and the first job. He always came back home. Always. When Clarissa came into his life, I thought I was lucky. She could charm the birds off the trees, and she had a laugh that filled the room. I remember her first Sunday at our kitchen table. She poured tea as if she'd been doing it her whole life. She had perfume that smelled faintly of lemon and something warmer I couldn't name, and she called me Ruth with the sort of sweetness that made me feel young for a minute. People in town like that. She slid into our life like a soft blanket. At first, I welcomed her. She looked after him in ways I hadn't had the strength for sometimes. She took the empty seat opposite me, and we talked about things every mother and daughter-in-law can talk about. Recipes, the prices at the farmer's market, the ridiculous politics on the radio. For a while, I slept better. For a while, I believed we were what families are supposed to look like. Messy and loving and full of the ordinary quarrels and reconciliations that make a home. That changed slowly. It was never one loud thing at first. It began with missed calls that went unanswered when I called to ask if Matthew would stop by. It was a portrait moved to another wall. Conversations that grew shorter. Visits that were so busy, and then, this weekend, promise. There were small exclusions that felt like a draft around the edges of a house. Nothing to fix easily. Nothing that made sense. In a small town, people notice that kind of draft. They whisper about it on porches and over fence posts. There were also little touches that stung. Clarissa would straighten the doilies in my living room in a way that suggested my taste was quaint. She'd move the guitar out of the sunlight and set a vase in its place. She'd refer to we when talking about plans that, to me, felt like they had always been my son's and mine. Once at a church supper, she told a neighbor that Matthew had grown away from certain things, and there was a particular coldness in her tone when she said it, like someone closing a window. When Matthew married her, I tried to be glad. I did my best to be there in the ways that matter. I made a dress for the rehearsal dinner, and I ironed his shirt the night before. I set aside my pride as a mother because I wanted joy for him. But even after the wedding, patterns kept shifting. Visits came less often. When he did come, he seemed split between old family habit and a new life I could not enter. I pushed away the prickling worry with small mercies. They're young, I told myself. People change. They'll come around. But the small town notices such things and makes stories of them, and stories have a way of becoming a weight. The morning of his funeral was the coldest morning I can remember. The sky had that thin blue that seems to hold its breath before it breaks. Snow powdered the little cemetery hill like sifted flour, and even the church bell sounded like it was wrapped in cloth. The town turned out because that's what small towns do. They come together for the ones they've lost. There were faces I'd known my whole life, neighbors who had watched Matthew grow up, teachers, people from the bakery where he used to buy day-old rolls for breakfast. I had my best coat on, the one with the worn lining, and my rosary clenched in my fist so tight that the beads pressed into my palm. I walked up to the church door, and there she was, Clarissa, squared in the doorway with a look I couldn't read. She stood between me and that doorway like a gate. For a moment, I thought she might move. Instead, she smiled a certain smile, the kind that hides a plan, and the door shut in my face. Not gently. It didn't creak. It slammed. There are few sounds that break a person the way a church door slamming can. It is an act meant to be final. People behind me stilled like birds. A child somewhere began to cry. I pressed my hand to the wood, and all the small townspeople's eyes found me. Some looked away. Some looked away because they were ashamed of what had happened. Some looked as if they had always known which way things would go. "That's not right," someone near me said softly. I wanted to laugh, to say I'd rather be inside, to tell them I'd be fine, but the words were gone. All that remained was the sound of the bell and the cold pressing in. She said it with a steady voice. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady, the sort of voice that tests a fact and then sets it down like a brick. "You're no longer family." I remember the taste of iron, of old pennies rising in my mouth. I remember thinking, no, he would never. But those thoughts are the ones you have when your heart is wrestling a truth it doesn't want. People who felt close to me came and put their hands on my shoulders afterward, which was kind, and we stood on the sidewalk like driftwood, watching a life go by that had been folded away. I walked home with my rosary in my pocket, and a village full of eyes on me. After the funeral, the town's kindness began to thin, not all at once, but in the small ways that cut deeper than any shouting. Someone would cross the street. Invitations ceased. The grocery store cashier looked at me with an unsteady sympathy that made me want to sink into the floor. Gossip, when it comes in a small place, is a slow leak in a roof. It's not always loud, but it saturates everything over time. I'd find my name said in tones that tried to be careful, but I could hear the rest of the sentence that was meant to follow. They were trying to guess what had happened. People do that with grief. They try to make a pattern where there is only ache. I went home and sat at the kitchen table. The house felt too big and too small, like a coat you haven't worn in years. The guitar sat where he had left it, faded strings catching the light, books he'd been reading spread on the stool. I put my hands on those things like they were anchors. At night, I would take his jacket off the peg and breathe it, as if to convince myself that he had been in that coat, that he had leaned across the table and squinted at the crossword, that the world had been ordinary. He had been ordinary for me, in those ways that mean everything. When the initial days of grief began to smooth into a kind of numbness, there was another fear that had been lying like a stone under the water. I wondered about the will. I knew, as anyone in a small place does, that there are practicalities after someone dies. Who would be in charge of the house? What would happen to the things that made up a life? I had no riches to keep my mind busy, only the house we'd shared and the memories packed into its corners. I found myself imagining dark possibilities, that I would be forgotten in a pile of paperwork, that the life we had built would be folded and sent away. It wasn't proud worry. It was a very human one. About a week after the funeral, the call came from Mr. Whitaker. He's been in town as long as I have, a man with a tidy suit and eyes that look like they've seen many winters. He's also a friend of the family, respectful, a quiet sort of man who knows when to be soft and when to be firm. He invited me to his office to read the will. He said it like a necessary thing, a calendar entry. He did not add flourishes. He's not the kind to do that. When I told Clarissa, she said she'd be there. Her tone carried that same cool confidence it always had, the one that suggested she had the day mapped out and a seat already claimed. There were people in our town who had begun to speak in two different ways about us, those who took my side and those who assumed there had been trouble. But nobody had any answers that mattered. The only paper that would tell me anything was the one Mr. Whitaker would unfold on his desk. The morning I went to his office, the sky was thin with light, and the icy hush had that brittle quality. His office sits near the town green, a brick building you notice when you pass, but never expect to enter. Inside, the air smelled like coffee and old books. There was a clock on the wall that ticked with a steady, gentle insistence. Mr. Whitaker welcomed the inn as if I were a neighbor dropping by for tea. He poured coffee into a paper cup for me and one for himself, and we took our seats around the oak table where a stack of envelopes sat waiting. Clarissa arrived on time, of course. She wore a coat that made people turn their heads and gloves that were too thin for the weather, and she carried herself with the kind of assurance that can be a small armor. She had a young man with her I recognized only as a lawyer, a professional who stayed in the background and kept his face like a neutral photograph. She took a seat across from me, and there was an air in the room that felt like the hush in a church just before the preacher begins. People in town like rhythm. There are things you do and times you do them. A will reading is a town event in its own private way. Mr. Whitaker had the will folded in front of him. He began to read with the slow, careful cadence of someone who knows hearts are listening. He read the simple bequests first, things that made me smile in the middle of my fear. Matthew left his guitar to a boy at the school who had been taking lessons. He left his books to the library, some old songs to friends, a few donations to the little soup kitchen on the corner. Those things made sense. They were the kind of choices Matthew might have made, the kind that speak of a person's small truth. Clarissa's face was all poise as the list continued. I watched her along with the rest of the people in that room, and I felt like someone watching a film of my life. The town's eyes were on the way the name Matthew had spoken in life now sat on a piece of paper. There was a legal order to the reading, and with each item read aloud, my pulse ticked like the clock on the wall. As the list dwindled, I tried to make myself small so I would not be a spectacle. My hands were folded under the table. The rosary I'd had in my pocket was there, warm from my skin. The air felt thick in that room, as if we had all been breathing through wool. Mr. Whitaker folded his glasses back into their case, a small motion that felt important, and then he reached the end of the page. He paused. A pause is a dangerous thing. It stretches like a ledge under your feet. In small towns, pauses are where people imagine whole drama.
Clarissa's lawyer cleared his throat in a polite way, and Clarissa's eyes flicked to me once, just once, like a place he had left empty on a map. "Mr. Whitaker?" she said, voice soft, as if the world might break at a loud word. He looked at the folded page, then at all of us. I remember thinking he looked older than he ought to have seemed at that moment. Then he unfolded the last paper. The room hushed again. The clock on the wall kept ticking. I felt the tick like a metronome set to measure my heartbeat. The last page lay there between us, like the edge of winter light on a snowbank, bright and cold and hard to see through. He cleared his throat and began to read. He read the usual formalities, words we've all heard in such moments. He read with the measured respect of a man who has read too many things that change people's lives. As he spoke the name Matthew on that page, I felt small and large at once. Small because this was something I could not control, large because it was the whole of what had been given and now redistributed like seeds. And then, when only a sentence or two remained, he paused. He looked down, and for a breath, the room went colder. He folded his hands on the table, and his voice changed into something softer, like a man remembering a tune. He drew a paper from the packet and set it on the table like someone showing an old photograph. He cleared his throat once more and said, "There is one final clause." It's a funny thing how silence fills a room right before an answer. It presses against your ears so that you can almost hear your own bones. People leaned forward without intending to. Even the clock seemed to weigh more. "Before I read it," Mr. Whitaker said, "I want to make sure everyone understands that," he chose his words carefully, his mouth forming the sentence like a careful stitch, "that everything here is the decedent's expressed will. It's his voice." In that instant, my heart, which had been like a bird in a cage, pressed so hard I thought it might escape. My hands had a heat that did not belong to me. Clarissa's look was unreadable now. The lawyer beside her sat very still, his fingers folded tight. I told myself the worst part wasn't the cold. The worst part was waiting with your whole life inside your chest, and knowing there is a paper that will say whether that life counts for anything to the person you loved. Mr. Whitaker moved his eyes across the room slowly, as if he were offering us the chance to prepare for what came next, though no one could prepare for a thing written long ago by a man who had died. He lifted the page and began to speak again. And that is where the story pauses for a breath that holds all the rest of it. He set the paper down gently, like something that belonged more to memory than to law. Mr. Whitaker's voice softened as if he were reading a thing meant only for me. "I leave Ridgewood Hill to my mother." he said. The words landed like sunlight on new snow.
For a moment, the room made no sound but the clock. My knees went weak. I remember thinking absurd things, of stitches in a hem, of a chipped teacup, and then hearing a laugh I did not recognize, a small sound that came out of me when the world tilted in a way I had not expected. He kept reading, and to accompany this bequest, I have left a letter to my mother, to be delivered upon her taking possession. He set the envelope before me, the flap still unsealed. My name was on it in his hand. No flourish, just his name and my own. My fingers trembled when I picked it up. The paper had the faint smell of the tobacco that Matthew used on rare evenings, and of the cedar that lined the drawer where he kept his things. Clarissa made a sound that was less of surprise and more like a small engine stalling. The lawyer with her took a step forward, then stopped. For a breath, every eye in that room watched my hands as if they could read the life inside them. I opened the envelope with slow carefulness, as if any sudden motion might unravel something fragile. The letter was folded into thirds, the paper soft where it had been handled. His handwriting, always a little crooked, as if he'd been writing in the light of a late lamp, looked like him. I read it once, and the words landed under my ribs. "Mother," he wrote, "if you've got this, then you know I thought about the house a lot. I kept thinking of you in the kitchen, and how the light comes across the floor in the late afternoons. I want Ridgewood Hill to be a place people know they can come to. Don't lock the doors against the town. Let the music in. Plant maples if you're in the mood. Keep the guitar by the window. I love you. Matthew." There were more lines, small instructions and little jokes, a note about a bowl he'd wanted me to have back, a recollection of a rainy afternoon when he'd painted the back fence a ridiculous blue. He signed it like always, with a shorthand that made me smile through the salt in my throat. He had not left me money in the way the world tells of leaving money, but a house is a kind of language. It was his last sentence translated into something I could hold. The air in the room felt thin. Clarissa's face had drained of color. The lawyer's jaw worked. Mr. Whitaker closed his glasses with a soft click and set his hands on the table. "This was Mr. Matthew's final declaration," he said plainly. "It is as he wished." After the reading, there was a kind of ripple. People murmured as if they had heard a small miracle or a small scandal. This is what happens in small places when private lives become public like that. Some offered me a hand. Some could not meet my eyes. Clarissa walked out of the office with a carriage that spoke of a plan reorganized. She said nothing to me, but once, outside, she turned and met my gaze. There was a hardness there that made me think of winter banks, packed snow, and the way it resists the foot that tries to break it. Not long after, I received the formal notice. Mr. Whitaker arranged things with the quiet efficiency of a man who had been asked to stitch two lives together with an invisible thread. People congratulated me once the news leaked beyond the office door, but the congratulation had edges. In a small town, inheritance is a headline that will be discussed on porches and in the pews. Some said the right things, others kept a polite distance, as if they were wary of stepping into a story that had thunder in it. If you have ever been relieved and afraid at the same time, you know the strange double beat of my days then. I walked the rooms of Ridgewood Hill as if I were learning the names of old friends. The house smelled of dust and the faint tang of the pond outside, of lemon oil and of a faint perfume that smelled like someone who had once tried to make a place feel new. The floors creaked in ways that seemed to say, "Welcome back," though I was not sure how welcome I felt. Of course, there were complications. Clarissa filed papers of her own. I remember when the envelope came, plain, official, like a thing that asks you to stand trial. She contested the will. She alleged, in careful legal language, that there had been improprieties. She said things I could not imagine him thinking. It felt like a hand reaching for something that had been placed in my palms by the boy I had raised. I will not dwell on legalities. It is enough to say that the town watched again. There were whispers that tried to be sympathetic, and others that tried to be clever. People chose sides the way they choose election signs, with small flags stuck in their private yards. Mr. Whitaker was steady. He came to see me, sat in my kitchen with his coffee and the same clock on the wall keeping time while I poured tea like it might steady my nerves more than anything else.
He never offered anger. He offered facts that were not harsh but were firm. "The documents reflect Matthew's expressed intent," he would say, and then he'd add quietly, "and that will be upheld." Days turned into a waiting I knew too well from other times in my life. There were the ordinary tasks of a house, the bills, the insurance forms, the call from a neighbor asking if they could borrow my ladder, and then there was the particular kind of ache that waits for a legal stamp. I found small mercy in the routine. I made soup for the woman next door. I returned a lawnmower to a boy down the road. I dusted and found old photographs in the frames. Matthew at 5 with chocolate on his chin, Matthew at 17 with his head full of plans. The house had been part of our life for so long that unwrapping it again felt like airing sheets on a line. The challenge was heard in a court not far from our town. I went once, because you go where your life is being spoken of, and found a sober room lined with chairs and a few faces I recognized. I sat with Mr.
Whitaker, who'd worn his steady suit, and that look of someone whose job is to keep the edges of things from tearing. Clarissa's lawyer was there as well, and there was a formality to the whole thing that made my heart pound in an old rhythm of anticipation. The judge listened and asked the kind of questions that seemed intended to find truth without cruelty. There is a way the law asks for facts and leaves out feelings, and sometimes that is mercy. Then, after a time that felt longer than it likely was, we heard that the challenge had been dismissed. The paper said succinct things. The judge's words were measured. It was enough. I felt something lift that I had not known had pressed so hard against my chest. Relief came slow. The town, too, started to unfreeze in its own way. People began to visit without the guarded look, as if the fact of the court's decision had let them breathe more easily. Some of those who had kept their distance came with casseroles and awkward apologies. Others never returned, and that was a kind of sorrow I learned to carry without surprise. There was no public celebration. The house did not feel like a prize to be paraded. It felt instead like a place finished with grief and ready for the small business of living. I set about moving in. The movers were not grand, they were neighbors. They came with trucks that had been used to carry pianos and Christmas trees, and they carried in boxes with my name on them, and boxes labeled with Matthew's soft hand. They whispered as they worked, as if the house was a patient we did not want to wake with too much noise. I put the guitar back in the window where the late light fell, just as Matthew had said in his letter. The nick in the varnish was there, a small map of a careless boy beating time to his own rhythms. I tuned it, though I am no musician, and the sound it made in that big room was enough to make me know the house was listening. That first winter night in Ridgewood Hill, I found more of his letters. There were parcels in the desk, envelopes tucked between pages in his books, a stack beneath the loose floorboard in the attic, a secret trove of small things. Each letter was a fragment of him, a little of the man who had been stubborn about his socks and gentle about his friends. Some were practical notes, heaters in the study if you need it, and some were the kind of small apologies we all leave for one another unintentionally. "Sorry I left the mower lid open, Ma." One, folded and worn, had a joke in the margin that made me laugh so hard I cried. There was one letter that was longer. He'd written it on a night I think he must have been thinking of us both at once. He spoke of the house not as property but as a place of belonging. He wrote of how he had watched me in the kitchen, of how he hoped I'd let the garden return to a shape where children could run through it, and men could stop for lemonade. He wrote about forgiveness, not as obligation, but as a place where you could lay down a weight. He asked me to let his friends come by. He told me, in that small way he had, that if I ever wanted to, I should give people reasons to come together under that roof. His handwriting ran at the end, and he closed it with an "I know you will make her proud," a line that erased years of small separations, like the sweep of a hand. The days after were full of simple work. I painted the swing on the back porch the ridiculous blue he'd used on the fence. I filled the bird feeders and planted a few maples, timid at first, and then with more courage as the soil took to the roots. Neighbors came. The Wilsons brought a load of compost and their 2 grandchildren. Mrs. Finch from the bakery insisted on bringing a pie and a stack of stories.
We fixed the porch light that had been blinking. We replaced a broken pane in a window, and I told stories of Matthew's childhood to a circle of women who leaned in as if each tale were a cup of hot tea. Music started to come back into the rooms. There were nights when the kitchen smelled of stew, and the living room had a guitar and two voices out of tune, and the sound of children learning chords because someone had offered a lesson. People began to place their shoes at the door again, and the clatter of boots on the mat became a kind of hymn. I began to host small suppers, no grand announcements, just a card stuck on the community board. Soup Tuesday, 6 p.m., all welcome. The first Tuesday was slow, the second was fuller. By summer, the table was long, and the garden had taken the shape Matthew had imagined. There were lines of laughter on the lawn, where once quiet had sat like a guest who no longer wished to leave. Clarissa grew less present in those days. She did not become a villain in a novel. She became the absence that is noticed the most when a house begins to hum. People saw her sometimes at the market, in the same week as they saw her in town. Her hair pulled back, a look like someone who had been given a script she did not want to read. There were no public fights, no headlines. She contested what she thought she needed to contest, and when the court had decided, she withdrew. I do not know the details of where she went or why she stayed away. She was not spoken ill of by me. That would have been easy, and it would have been a poor tribute to the man who had asked me to plant maples. When she passed by the house one afternoon months later, her head turned away as if in respect. I think that is the kindest way to remember it. The town's posture softened. People who had once given me the sidelong glance began to ask after my health or my garden plans. They brought their grandkids to eat something warm and to sit by the fire and hear stories.
The little soup kitchen got a steady patronage from the Ridgewood Hill volunteers, and there were evenings where the house was warmed by the clink of plates and the murmur of voices that had not been given many places to gather. I learned that inheritance is less about deeds and more about permission. Matthew had given me permission to open the house back to the town. He had given me a reason to be there. He had given me a letter that told me to let life in. Still, forgiveness is an act you choose more than it is a feeling you simply find. I could have spent my days thinking of that church door and of the sound it had made when it shut. I could have let my days be ruled by grievance and a sense of being wronged. Instead, I made a deliberate choice. When Clarissa's name came to mind with a twinge, I would breathe and remember the line in his letter that said, "Don't lock the doors against the town." Forgiveness in that case was not an erasure of what happened. It was a way to stop letting the past write my days. There were quiet moments that felt like small miracles. One afternoon, I found a note tucked into the guitar case. It read, "If you ever need to, play the third string a half step higher than usual. The neighbors like it that way." That made me laugh aloud. I thought of Matthew in his room, experimenting with pitch, making the world bend to a sound he liked. I tuned the guitar as he'd suggested and sat on the porch swing while a child from next door plucked a tentative chord. The small sound made the maple leaves tremble. For a woman who had once felt shut out, it felt like a kind of resurrection. Sometimes late at night, I would sit in the study by the firelight and read one of Matthew's longer letters. He had a way of writing that let you walk with him through his thinking. Once he wrote about a winter when the road had been blocked and we had been snowed in together, and how we had made hot chocolate and read aloud. He left me recipes scribbled in the margins. "Add a little cinnamon," he had written at the edge of the page where I had written grocery lists for decades. Each line made me both ache and heal. I learned to keep his voice in the things I did, the way I folded a napkin, the way I called someone who had not been called. I held a memorial of sorts in the house that first summer, a small afternoon where people brought flowers and stories, and the town bell played in the distance. We set plates on the long table, and children made small flags out of paper. There was a friend of Matthew's who played an old song, and the guitar sang the way it had years ago, simple and true. We watched children chase a stick along the lawn, and felt for a few hours like the house had been turned back into what it was meant to be, a shelter, a place to be seen. Part of what I learned in that house was how to accept help.
Neighbors who once kept their distance grew into friends who brought over bags of seedlings and the strength to haul an old trunk out of the attic. Mr. Whitaker came by now and then to read in the parlor or to hand me a package of bills with an acquaintance's kind remark. Once, when I was struggling to fix a loose step, a group of boys, teenagers who had once been held wrapped by Matthew's guitar, came by and did the work in an afternoon. They would not accept money. Instead, they asked if I would keep some of Matthew's stories alive for the younger ones. It felt right. Time softens things. It does not smooth every edge, but it wears a different kind of patina on grief. Ridgewood Hill began to gather new memories over the old. The swing creaked in a different way, because new children learned how to jump off it, to see how far they could soar. I planted more maples, because the first ones grew, and because watching a tree change through seasons is a slow sermon in patience and hope. There were afternoons when I stood on the back porch and thought of that winter morning at the church, and I could feel the cold like a bruise under my ribs. But then I would look at the children playing, at the neighbor who had come to read the newspaper with me, at the string of lights over the patio, and I would think of Matthew's instruction that the house be open to the town. His last public act in life had been to give me a charge, to keep the place alive. That charge became a balm. People would ask me, sometimes in strange tones, whether I felt vindicated. I never liked that word for what happened. Vindication sounds sharp. What I felt was settled. There was justice, quiet and unornamented. A paper had called me what I was, and a court had affirmed that the last wishes of a man who had loved me were to be respected. I did not feel victorious. I felt more and more responsible. Through the seasons, the house changed again. Autumn painted the maples in that rich Vermont fire color, glory in the way only New England light can make the world glow, and the house looked like something out of a painting. Winter came with the clean hush we all know. Spring was a slow, patient thing. Summer brought visitors. Songs rose from the porch. I kept Matthew's guitar on its hook, the strings slightly worn where he used to strum. Once, when the kids from down the road had a campfire, someone asked me to sing. I said no at first, but the request was kind and steady, and in the end I sat with the guitar and sang a tune he taught me on a rainy afternoon years ago. My voice was not young, but the song found places in the room where his voice used to live, and for the first time in a long while, I felt the two of us standing in the same doorway, his life and the life I still had. There were notes from people I had lost and people I had hardly known. A woman I had helped once at the post office sent a small ceramic bowl with the note, "For soup when you need for extra mouths." Mrs.
Finch wrote, "Your tables saved us the other night. The world became, in that small place, a place where life was stitched back together with common things." I did not make a proclamation. I did not sit on a platform and declare a new era. Instead, it came in the small ways that matter most: a baby's first steps across a well-waxed floor, a teenager taking his first guitar lesson on the lawn, an old friend helping me plant bulbs. When people told me that I had been brave, I shook my head. There is bravery in certain things, but I felt I had simply followed what had been given. Matthew had left me a house and a request: make it home again. I had the choice to respond with anger or with welcome. I chose welcome. Toward the end of that first year, on a late afternoon when the light bent like a benediction across the hills, I stood on Ridgewood Hill's front balcony. The town lay like a patchwork quilt beneath the rolling rise, and the green mountains hunched on the horizon in a way that made the sky look larger. My fingers wrapped around the old iron key that hung from my keyring. It was heavy with the sort of weight that tells you what things mean. The wind smelled of cut grass and wood smoke. A child laughed somewhere by the elm. The church bell rang, a considerate sound that felt like something blessed. I thought of the winter morning when the door slammed and my rosary had felt heavier than it had any right to be. I thought of the pause in Mr. Whitaker's reading and the letter with Matthew's small handwriting that told me to plant maples. I thought of the days of court, of the people who had stood by me, of the neighbors who had brought ladders and pie and stories. I had promised myself, silently, that if I ever found that my anger wanted to be louder than my love, I would choose smaller things. I would choose the work of making rooms warm, the ritual of watering a sapling, the stubborn act of answering the phone when someone called for help. Those things are not flashy. They are slow. They are the work of ordinary grace. On that balcony, I pressed the key into my palm and felt the groove where the years had rubbed it smooth. I turned it over and thought of the title they had given this story, of how some people thought I'd give up.
There was a small private amusement in that idea. To give up would have been to hand the house to silence. Instead, I held the last document, and beyond the paper there was a different thing, a task, a choice, a lifetime of small gatherings. If there is a moral to what happened, it is not found in the court's dismissal or in the deed that bears my name. It is found in the way a man's last words can change the shape of a house, in the courage it takes to open a door after it has been shut, and the decision to let music and meals and children fill a place once more. Love, in the end, is very practical. It asks you to keep the kettle on and to set another plate. It asks you to remember how someone liked his guitar tuned. It asks you to plant a tree. Before I go, I want to say something to you who are listening. If something in this story has found a place in your chest, if you too have ever been pushed away and then given a small, stubborn reason to return, then tell me where you're watching from in the comments. Tell me a little of the place you call home. I like to know who keeps these stories with me. And if you have a story of family, of loss, of an unexpected inheritance of love, tell it. Share it with someone who needs to hear that dignity can be returned and that a letter, a paper, a quiet choice can fix a crooked thing. If you like these true stories, please consider subscribing. We will tell more. We will sit together with our tea and our memories, and we will remind one another that houses are built by hands and healed by hearts. Tonight, I will set the guitar on its stand, and I will open one more letter. There is a lamp in Matthew's study that glows like an old friend. I will light it and read about the things that made him laugh. Outside, the maples I planted stand like patient sentinels. Inside, the house is warm. I press my palm to the window, and the glass gives back a reflection of a woman who has been humiliated and who has been loved back into a place that is, at last, hers to hold. They thought she'd give up. She did not. She held the last document, and she made home of it.